We are very grateful to Fred Wherry, class of 1996, who was going to be a 7 speaker at the symposium in March, and also was going to have a panel discussion as well. So he was an all-star for that now canceled event, and he has been a real sport and has made the pivot to do his 7 talk today for us by Zoom. And so Fred, also on his phone, making me feel better about being on my phone, is going to give his 7 talk today. Fred, I will give you the mic, and we are all looking forward to hearing what you have to say today.
Yes, so it's great to see you again, Megan, and I look forward to seeing you once the troubles pass in the flesh. So as a sociologist, one of the privileges of my life is I get to talk to people about their money problems. It's something that I enjoy doing. But I thought today what I start out by doing is first talking about my own money problems. It was the early 1990s, nearly 30 years ago. And back then as an undergraduate student, the one thing I knew how to do is bounce a check. So the general process for me was that I'd walk across the pit into the student stores, write a check for $20 cash, knowing that the bank was going to impose fees that were greater than that $20, and I would take my money. And I did this for a concentrated short period of time. Thankfully, I got a letter from Wachovia that was pretty stern, indicating that I had racked up all of these fees and they were going to close my account. And I had to then call my parents. And this is the great moment of shame. So the reason that I hadn't called them in the first place was because I was trying to keep my chin up. I had been invited out with friends, and I had gone through a period where some lumpy expenses had shown up. And rather than ask for help, I decided just to go it alone. And this sense of self-worth, as I understood it, was accompanied by apparently some very quiet feelings of anger towards my father, which, you know, I found out later in psychoanalysis. And so this got in the way of me doing something that was rationally didn't make any sense for me, because I had access to parents who would have been more than willing to step forward and help me. And I was unwilling to ask for the help. Now, one of the things that I later realized in life was that my story is not an uncommon one. And in fact, there were stories that were much worse than my own. So in January of this year, I sat down with a woman, we'll call her Sarah. She's nearly 60 years old, and she saw a flyer that some of the nonprofits in the area had distributed on my behalf, saying, if you've ever had trouble with your debts, if you've been called by a debt collector, please call this researcher at Princeton. He wants to hear your story. And so she called me, and I was standing out in front of a little sandwich shop. She met me there. I saw her walk by the sandwich shop because she thought I was going to be standing outside. And she was somehow not willing to walk into the sandwich shop without knowing for sure that I was in there. So I had to go back outside and say, sorry, you are out here waiting. It's kind of cold. She said, oh, I just didn't want to go in there and not look as if I didn't have a purpose. Then we sat down, and I kind of first tried to open the conversation by letting her know that, you know, there are about 77 million adults in the US who have had an account turned over to collections. So it's a fairly widespread problem. The difference is that because it's turned over to collections and because it's a quiet kind of crisis, we never hear about it. She seemed to be relieved to hear this, and also relieved to hear that all I wanted to know is the last time she found herself in this predicament, and how she thinks she got into the predicament. She had a small child with her. It's a grandchild. And she said, well, one of the things that's been difficult for me is that currently I'm not working. And as you can see, I've got my hands full. And another moment we were supposed to meet, we had to reschedule because her appointment at the oncologist had gone long. And she noted that she lives with her daughter. Her daughter needs childcare assistance. They can't afford the childcare assistance. So I said, well, did you look at some of the public options available to you? And she noted that, well, we were on the list, but once you move house, and when people have financial problems, they move house quite a lot, you find yourself having to start all over again in a new place. The other thing she did that I found useful, and one of the things I like to do when I'm talking to people about money, is she said, you asked me if I could bring some bank statements and if I could bring the letters themselves from the debt collectors, and I have nothing to hide. I want you to see all of this. So she pulled it out of the purse, and we went through as she tried to figure out, I think I know where that debt collection comes from, but I'm not sure. So this was someone with chronic debts. And so we talked about how she was thinking about prioritizing them, and she noted it's just hard to know what to do first. Then I asked, well, how much do you have in terms of income coming in? And she pointed to her disability check, which is about $1,400 a month, but then noted it's deposited directly into my bank account. And by the time it arrives, I already owe Bank of America about $400. And I said, what do you mean you owe them $400 or so? She said, well, I end up using the overdraft protection as my lifeline. And so I know that I'm not going to be able to pay my bills by the end of the month. I'm a grown woman. I don't want to ask anyone for anything. And I'm trying not to be a burden on my daughter. And so I just write a check when I need to write a check. And it's really costly. She then assured me that she had spoken to a financial counselor, and she was getting help with financial education. And she had promised her financial counselor she was going to close that line of overdraft credit. And she said, I know I promised. I know this is what I'm supposed to do. I just can't give up my lifeline right now. But next month, she told me, it'll get much, much better next month. Her life didn't start out this way. Before she and her husband worked, they had a home that they were proud of. Everything was going pretty well. And then one night, he didn't come home. He had been struck by another car on his way home. And there she was with the bills piling up. And her first priority, she said, is I wanted to try to protect my kids. I wanted to be a good mother, a strong mother, fulfill that role that I knew was my obligation. And I felt that they'd gone through enough already. So I tried to keep their consumption, try to keep their habits, let them go see their friends and do everything they were doing before. And it just didn't work. Then we moved to the question of, and I always like to ask this question because often we think about people who do debt collections as necessarily villains. And I think wherever there's a villain, there might also be a good guy. So I asked, have you had any good experiences with debt collectors in the past? And she said, oh yes, there's a very friendly fellow. He calls about my hospital debt. He asks me how I'm doing. He says, I know you're trying, and we're really willing and happy to work with you. And I try to find a way to make sure I can give them something. And then I asked, well, can you contrast that with an experience that you found not so helpful? And then she looked at me, she paused, and she says, well, sometimes there's so much disrespect. As soon as she called it disrespect, she paused and apologized. Maybe I shouldn't have said that. I'm sure they're just doing their jobs. But the way they treat you when you owe money, and I'm doing the best I can, and I asked, well, what did he say? Well, he said that I never really wanted to pay it back anyway. He was treating me like a thief, like I'm some dishonest person, and told me that he thinks that he should just stop calling, because why bother calling someone who's just trying to beat the system? She found this deeply offensive, and ended her description of this person's behavior by saying, "It's just not right. They were giving up on me." And so with so much to pay and no clear routes to paying off the debts, she sometimes wants help. She sometimes wants to be jolted with alerts to tell her that something is urgent. But she also wants to be treated as if her intentions are the right ones. And she finds it demoralizing and demobilizing when she's treated otherwise. Now, we were scheduled to have another set of conversations in about another month, and then COVID-19 set in and all face-to-face conversations came to an end. But my efforts have not. So what am I doing now? I will soon be following up with her by phone. I will also soon be following up with a number of other people who are so deeply indebted that their debts have been turned over to a local court. And we are going through the court system and identifying every court case against the debtor and on these small claims. We're trying to do it for all the states, but if you want to get into the weeds, what you will discover is that just finding information about what's happening in debt collections is nearly nearly impossible. And we can probably go for 10 to 15 states and get complete information with a very intensive data effort that is now underway. And the other ones, it'll be partial, but we're going to do it. The other thing that we are doing is we're taking seriously her need for self-affirmation. And we're asking these questions not only here in the US, but with partners working in Argentina, Brazil, Kenya, India, the UK, and elsewhere. This should have been an uplifting story, and I fear that it has not done the lifting that I had hoped that it would. But I hope what it does do is emphasize the importance of debt in our lives, how we quietly carry it, and to ask whether or not it is possible that people who carry debt may do it somehow with dignity. And now I open it up for your questions and comments.
Michael O'Reilly has a question. You want to unmute and ask? Thank you.
Sure. Thanks, Fred. Wonderful presentation. Do you have a sense, either with the folks you're working with or with the sociology literature, what percentage of these people are in debt, in difficult debt due to medical or hospital debt, and what's the reaction? You know, I'm a physician. I used to run a medical center, and I find that I'm on the phone 10 times a year with hospitals or physician practices, explaining to them either how they've billed incorrectly or negotiating with them and saying, look, what you're charging me is 5 times what Medicare or Medicaid would get. Why don't I give you that payment? And it's an odd conversation at that point. I mean, we're in a paradoxical time where the people with the least get charged the most. Can you just comment about how illness impacts indebtedness?
Yes. So we could think about illness and indebtedness in 2 different ways. So on the one hand, if you have medical debts, you probably have other debts as well. And so often you have the stress coming in of the other debts, and there have been some work published in the Journal of American Medicine linking cardiovascular health and stress to debt. to these kinds of harassing phone calls and harassing experiences with debt. There's a second challenge, and the second challenge is when you're telling people that they can negotiate. And sometimes they know that they can negotiate. They've been given all the information they need. Moment of the negotiation, they fail to deploy what they know. And so this is it's being worked on now. Legal scholars who are problem, and it's puzzling. All of these stories of people who have worked in financial clinics and tried to counsel people about how show up to court with all, and they will have been coached through safe when they get there. And once they are, there seems to be a lack of self-affirmation, both thrown off or windows, and they start to sort of shrivel. Then what happens? Proceeding, sometimes they'll be asked, "Oh,
Fred, you're sort of breaking up. I don't know whether
you had
can move around it. I don't know what.
Sorry.
You're still slightly breaking up. Is he breaking up for others as well? Just sort of slightly in and out. I don't know if you can sort of scooch a little bit. I know you're en route. I did have a private question, like, why is Fred in a car? Maybe he is traveling to New York City and very, very bravely allowed us to, still intrigued that he give his 7 talk. You want maybe go back about a thought and a half on what you were saying, Fred, and we'll see if we can try that again. Thanks.
Okay, so I'm going to get out of the car and see it do better. Hold on.
Okay.
To sound better here?
Yeah, that's good. Oops.
Okay, so
You froze a little bit though. Sorry. This is our tech day.
yeah, this is, oh.
If you go off camera, sometimes the audio comes through better.
Okay, let me try that. Is it better with me off camera?
We can hear you.
We can hear you.
Yeah. Let's give it a whirl.
Okay. Okay. So, so one of the challenges is that what you'll find when people are undergoing a lot of financial stress, and they seem to lack what we call a sense of self-affirmation. They may have all of the information they need, and they may have gathered adequate evidence for what they need when trying to challenge or negotiate their debts. And we see this in debt court in the moments of foreclosure. But then they fail to deploy in the moment that it really matters. And this failure to deploy happens in 2 different ways. So on the one hand, after they sort of leave the hearing and nothing positive has happened, they'll be asked, why didn't you use the materials that you gathered? And sometimes the response is, well, I wasn't sure what was going on. I walked in, I didn't quite know when to sit, when to stand, or what was going on. So I just kind of froze up, and I figured they would ask me for the material when I needed to present it. Then there are other moments in which they show up to try to defend themselves for a non-mortgage debt. And in those moments, they're then asked, do you owe this money? And when you're asked, do I owe money? Or when it seems to be hinted that maybe you never really intended to repay, they give a vigorous defense of their intention to repay. And instead of trying to negotiate what the price is, they stand and try to affirm, I am a person with moral worth, with strong moral character, and just because I was on hard times does not mean that I'm a thief. And they sort of do in their case. And so when I'm talking to some legal scholars, they say, we're having these moments where we're saying, look, we know you're a good person, but that's not what we're talking about right now for court. You're getting in your own way. And so sometimes in the moments in which people are trying to assert their sense of moral worth, they get in their own way. And other times when people are trying to demonstrate their sense of moral worth by way of how they take care of others and how they participate with others, they also find themselves taking out expensive debts and getting in their own way. And so one of the challenges when we're thinking about negotiation and when we're thinking about people trying to do self-defense in courtrooms is that they will likely have their best intentions used against them.
Fred, that you're coming through great there, unless you weren't done. And then
Oh, no, yeah, I'm done.
Okay, good.
Yeah.
That was awesome. You sound fantastic, and we've got some folks lined up wanting to ask you some questions. So I'm going to call on Adrienne Ashby to ask her question. Unmute, Adrienne, you're muted, thanks.
Hey, Fred, thanks for doing this. I was a year ahead of you, I think, at Carolina, but I totally remember you. I have been a legal aid lawyer for the last 20 years, and my specialty is senior citizens. All my clients are 60 or older. Right now, I work on a senior legal hotline where I advise seniors. I don't actually go to court with them or anything, but I give legal advice. And so your question, I think, is a really good one about, can they carry the debt with dignity? And for me, after 20 years, I have to say, no, I don't think there's a way. And I could be wrong, but I know that I spend a lot of my time talking to seniors who I have to convince that they are not sinners, immoral people, because they were working, then they became disabled, or they were fired or whatever, because of their age. And so now they can't pay. And I have to spend a whole bunch of time saying, listen, this is not a moral issue. When you borrowed the money, you intended to pay it back. Now you can't pay it back. The other thing that happens with seniors is a lot of my seniors are what we call collection proof, which means that they only get Social Security. They have an apartment. They don't have any real property that anybody can put a lien on. So there's no way that anybody can collect any money from them, right? So I tell them this, and I'm thinking they're going to say, whew, thank you so much, Miss Ashby. I'm going to get off this phone and not care what those collectors say. But no, they are my most insistent clients on wanting to pay it back. Even though I say, no, I want you to pay for your medications, your food, your rent before you pay these people any money, because they can't get anything from you. And they're insistent, and so then I have to give my talk about how this isn't a commentary on their rectitude, right? And so after having gone through all that, I feel like when they borrow, even if they have the intention of doing something, because it's usually always something good. And in my situation, I have a lot of clients who have rotten kids, and they're usually borrowing money to help their rotten kids. That's just what I call it. And so, but when they borrow money, they're trying to do something good, but that sense of owing somebody something weighs so heavily on them that I feel like it compromises their dignity right then, because because they feel less than because they actually can't afford it and they have to borrow.
Mhm. Yeah. This is sort of the classic form of abuse that dignity allows. One of the things that I'm trying to think through is when we have people like your clients who express a sort of some almost hardwired need to make sure that they can manifest their sense of moral rectitude. We have not designed some portal or some platform that allows them to exercise that need somewhere else. And so part of what you're saying is, okay, you're telling me you need to do this thing, but you can't do that at court. And the other problem is the only place they can try to do it is in the moment that they're talking to you. And you're trying to undo sort of a really deep-seated understanding of who they are as being sort of honest, hardworking people with good intentions, who believe that you should pay what you owe. And trying to undo that, I tell people, good luck. Good luck. The other difficulty is that the problems of the children and the grandchildren reach up, and it reaches up in the sense that sometimes they're getting calls for debts not by their kids, but by the collectors. And so one of the things that we did was we went to the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau's website just to look at the narratives from consumers. We scanned only about 4,000 of the narratives that were submitted. There were more than that, but we scanned 4,000. And in those 4,000 narratives, what we found was that you would have people who said, I don't know how they got my number, but they were calling about a kid or a grandkid. And of course, I'm trying to help the kid or grandkid. But I don't know how they got my number. And so once you hear that a kid or a grandkid is in trouble, you're going to try to help them. And so the collectors know this, and they use a technique to sort of leverage your social ties to generate more income from the debt. And so one of the questions that we should be asking is, if we know that debt collectors are mobilizing your social networks, and we know that they're mobilizing your sense of morality and your sense of worth, the only thing that you're going to use to overcome worth is worth. So what are we mobilizing? What do we need to build that allows them to affirm that sense of dignity, but to do it in a forum that's not going to have the kinds of negative consequences that it has when they do it in the presence of the collector, and in the presence of the court. So this is one of the questions that we're trying to ask. So we don't have a full answer to this, but we're hoping that there's gonna we're looking at sort of some design type of experiments with how do you design other types of platforms that allow people to do the things they need to do. And as a sociologist, one of the things I always say is that we have to stop telling people how they should feel, and then try to figure out what do we design around the way they already feel. What can we design around the triggers that are already working in their lives, but that are working against them. And so this is a trigger in which dignity is working against them and self-worth is working against them. We have to design a sort of something that takes it the other way.
Fred, Francis Wong has a question for you, Francis.
Okay.
Thanks. So I'm an academic economist, and my research focuses on consumer financial distress. So I found your work incredibly fascinating. And in my world, we worry a lot about the financial impacts of indebtedness. And so, we talk a lot about, paying high interest rates. And, conversely, it's easy for economists to worry relatively less about the billions of dollars of debt and collections given relatively low repayment rates. And so what I found really interesting about your work is that you're able to identify and measure costs that economists are not as good at identifying, so non-pecuniary costs. And a lot of policies have already been talked about at great length to try to mitigate the financial impacts on consumers. So, just the debate about whether or not we should allow payday loans. And so this, again, I suppose, related to what you were just talking about. I'd like to know if you can point to any regulations of financial products, or even sort of regulation of the debt collection space that you think would be effective in mitigating these sort of non-financial costs, and I guess help people manage debt with dignity. And particularly, the things that the current debate about regulation seems to be missing.
Yeah, so I think there are two things that might be helpful here. One is just the use of defaults that keep people out of impossible debts. And so one of the things that the Pew Charitable Trust Small Loan Program did is they have several case studies, one of them in Colorado, where they asked the question, on the one hand, we think that payday lenders are putting people into impossible debts, but people need the loans. And so one of the questions was, if you regulate payday lenders, are you then going to dry up opportunities for people who actually need debt, but they need it on much better terms? The answer they found was that when they turned the loans, they got rid of the balloon payment at the end. They turned them into installment loans that had to be at least, I think, 6 months. And they capped the interest rates. I think they were closer to 27, 28, 37, 38, in the 30s, a percentile APR. And they found that, in fact, credit didn't dry up. Instead, what happened was that the number of payday lenders that were available shrunk because they had to consolidate. And so instead of going to the borrowers and telling them to sort of figure things out in a better way, they went to the lenders and made the lenders become more lean. And so that was a story, I think, of just you can actually leave the borrowers in some respects alone and just make sure that the products are safer. Now, the second thing that we can think about here is the other difficulty of how hard it is for someone to stop using a payday lender if that's what they have grown accustomed to. And when I say it's hard to stop, it's not just a matter of them having information about its cost, but their menu of choice is something that's being shaped not only by but by those who are around them. And so if the people around you are using payday lending and other high cost services, and your family member tells you they have a need, and you say, I can't get the money, they are going to tell you, actually, you can get the money, because I saw the envelope that came yesterday that said you can have access to this money. I know that the neighbor went and did this for their kid or for their sister. And so how are you going to say no to your kid or your sister, and particularly for some types of needs that are seen as just kind of baseline dignity affirming? So, if your kid's in school, you want your kid to be able to be like the other kids. You want them to have, if you celebrate Christmas, you want them to have some version of Christmas, and you need to have it done on time. If someone's graduating, you can't say, I'm sorry, my check's not here yet. You need to have the graduation come off in time, right? And so there are these ways in which there are expectations about what you're supposed to be able to do, and offering up an individualized narrative about why you can't do it simply won't work. Sending people off to get education about why it's not beneficial for them to do it simply won't work. But when that information is tied to some kind of material benefit that they can draw on, or some alternative means of acquiring sort of better cost services, they're sometimes happy to make the move, but sometimes it takes them a long time to trust it enough to make the move.
That makes sense. And if I may ask a follow-up, it sounds then like you're sort of advocating for some sort of alternative financial product, some kind of sort of commitment savings device that prevents people from sort of being pressured into taking these high interest loans. Do you have any thoughts about, is there a missing market for those kind of financial instruments?
Yeah, so there's work being done that's being led by the Aspen Institute's financial security program and others, and they're trying to sort of think about what this missing market looks like here in the U.S. There's more work that's done on this outside of the U.S., which is why I find it helpful to go to other countries, and instead of telling them what we might be able to tell them or teach them, I'm like, well, what do you have to teach us? Because there's a bit more innovation, I think, happening outside of the U.S. And so there is this missing market. Now, the difficulty with the missing market is that as soon as you come up with some alternative service, you find yourself then being pressured to generate more profits from that alternative service. And so there's a guy, Tim Wise, who was a postdoc at Stanford, and he was writing about sort of the experiences of these social entrepreneurs who have, hearts of gold. They come up with this thing that kind of works but needs a lot of support. And then they start feeling the pressure of, well, what else can you do to generate profits from the service? And so they find themselves being pressured to then squeeze more out of people who are already wrung dry. And so that's the other challenge of the alternative market, is that we don't have kind of an ethos of what would life look like if we just decided that structurally some people are just over indebted. They are not going to make more money than they make now. Their patterns of behavior are going to be preyed upon. And some of them are going to intentionally do things that are not good for them and not care. And so when you have that version of a mess, sometimes the market can do some things for you, but it can't do everything. But in this country, we don't spend enough time thinking about what the market might be able to do.
So Fred, we have a few folks kind of lined up for questions. And so I'll just, Toos, and then Peter's question, then Jonathan, Ginger, and Michael's question. So Toos, do you want to jump in and ask your question first?
Thanks, Megan. I'm happy to see lots of early 90s UNC folks on the call. Nice to see some old faces again. So Fred, thanks a lot for the talk. Is there anything as a consumer of financial services from various institutions, is there any sort of report card on how they manage their debt and collection where I could apply pressure by taking my financial services to other institutions that do a better job? And it also seems to me that the collector you mentioned who was willing to work with your case would get better results from collecting in that manner than a more aggressive approach. And hopefully that's true and leads to some change. And finally, what do you think education in high school should do about finances going forward?
Oh yeah, so this the great trifecta of what to do, and it's great to see you again, Toos, after so many years. Yeah, it's funny. I'm like seeing these faces. I'm like, oh my God, these people are, they're doing well and they're here. Okay, so here are a couple of thoughts. One on education. It's surprising how little financial education we do. And it's also surprising how we deliver it. So I've had this experience myself. When I go to a gym, and I've done this because of concerns about, it was more vanity than anything else. And you get a trainer, and the trainer says, well, let's think about your goals, but they base your goals on where you are right now. And typically when we do financial education in schools, there's an ideal version of a consumer, and that for many people simply does not exist in their life. and it doesn't exist in any of the lives that are near to them. And so they find it very hard believing the stories that they're told. And so one of the alternatives to this is just-in-time kind of coaching, where people are introduced to different kinds of services and tools in moments in which those services and tools are going to be salient for their lives. And so that's something that's being worked on now. The first question was, again, if you could just recap the first question.
So if I was a consumer of financial services and
the scorecards.
Yeah, a report card, and take my business to somewhere that does a better and more just way of collecting debt, is there something I can look to?
So the National Consumer Law Center, right now, not really. So the National Consumer Law Center, one of the things that they have done is they'll just tell you who are the top 3 debt collectors in each state. So they do that. But what we don't know, sometimes debt collectors are, they're not all of them are bad, right? So sometimes they're just collecting debts and they're above board. Now, so what we're trying to do now is we're working with a group called January Advisors. They're a data science group. They're based, I think, in Houston. And we're working with them now on can we build out an infrastructure where we at least know who is taking people to court for their debts and what the outcomes are of that, and geocoding it and sort of linking it with census data and all that. So we're working on that right now, but that infrastructure does not yet exist. And one of the challenges too is that the courts, so you have all these county courts with almost their own lingo and rules, and they've got their own data systems that are not always easy to access, which is why we're working with this outfit to sort of try to build out this infrastructure. Once we do that, we'll know much more about the plaintiffs, we'll know much more about outcomes, and we'll make it publicly available. But that's another, okay, stay tuned. So we'll put something out in this academic year, but it's probably a good 2 years of work to make that robust and useful. And so we're working on scorecards. We don't have it yet. There are scorecards for how states and others are dealing with foreclosures, and that's being run out of the eviction lab, which is also run by one of my colleagues in the sociology department, Matt Desmond. Yeah. I should probably take the one other. I know you guys had 3, but I should probably take another question because of the time.
Sorry, I was muted there just a second. Peter McCullough's question is, of the clients you work with that owe money, what is the median delinquent loan balance per person, not per account?
So right now, I can't say. So right now, the best we're going to be able to do is for some of the states, we're going to know every single debt case has gotten so bad that it's been turned over to the courts. And we'll know there we can sort of figure out whether or not multiple people are, multiple plaintiffs are bringing in the same debtors, et cetera. Getting debt data is notoriously hard. The Urban Institute managed to, they looked at credit reports, and they worked with Experian to do some work on this. But trying to get this information is incredibly hard. In a qualitative interview context, when you ask people, are these all of your debts? And they'll think they are, and they'll start talking. They'll say, oh, there's another one, but I don't know where that one is. I don't know how much it is. And they'll look at one bill and they'll say, I don't actually remember making this one, but I probably made it. And so one of the difficulties is that in the qualitative interviewing, we're not getting reliable data on quantities. And so we're going to rely on what we can get out of the court data for at least that segment of the debtor population.
Thanks, Fred. Jonathan Justice, you are up next.
Hey, thanks, Megan. Hey, thanks, everyone. Fred, great to see you.
Good to see you.
I just want to point out, it is super shameful that a couple of guys from the same small town area of South Carolina live in New Jersey and haven't connected personally. So I'm right outside the city. If you're on your way tonight, stop by.
Okay. I'm down in Princeton, but yeah.
Well, I'm in Short Hills, so I'm an hour from you.
Yeah. Oh yeah, you're close. You're close.
Yeah, my son plays lacrosse down there all the time. So I'll be quick about this. Tom Morris actually hit on something in the chat that was a question that I had brewing, and I'm not sure if I'm going to articulate it the right way. Forget about how I made the transition to what I do. I'm a wealth advisor and a private banker, and I work with clients from a couple of $1 million up to a couple of $1 billion. And what Tom said in the chat is something that I've seen too. At one end of the debt spectrum, it's a burden, it's shameful, it's something that needs to be dealt with. At the other end of the spectrum, we don't even call it debt, we call it leverage, and it's a point of pride, right? How cheap, how much cheap debt can you get? How much can you continue just to roll it over and roll it over? At one end of the spectrum, you know, what is insurmountable debt. At the other end of the spectrum, we just call it evergreen. So, you know, have you looked at some of the drivers behind attitudes towards debt, not just around net worth, but, you know, other sociological aspects of individuals who hold debt, and what may drive their attitudes towards it, or their predilections towards amassing it?
Yeah. So so this is a wonderfully useful observation. And one of the challenges to how people think about debt, and when you talk to them about how they learned about debt, they usually learn from the people around them, and so you have this sort of social reproduction of attitudes towards debt that can be somewhat self-defeating. It's sort of the thing that you're going to have to take on, and once you take it on, all they talk about is, I just want to be debt-free. I just want to be debt-free, and with no real pathway to becoming debt-free. And so the other thing that we know is that there are differences by sort of social background in terms of when people start thinking about other types of financial products, and other types of ways of using their money. And when you then interview them and ask them, oh, well, how did you learn about this? They'll say, oh, well, you know, when I was growing up, I would just overhear things. Now, colleges are places where you can start seeing some spillage, right? So there are people who may not have families where they heard or learned about things, but they start getting, you can get spillage in these socially mixed spaces of college, which is why some colleges are very deliberate about, I know what we do here at Princeton is, your first year, you're going to get a set of suite mates that you cannot choose. And we do that so that you get these spillover effects that you would not have gotten if you just were allowed to self-select into spaces where you feel most comfortable self-selecting into. And so part of what we have to really think about is the extent to which our social ties and our social networks are going to help perpetuate these kinds of attitudes. And unless there are opportunities where you break them up and recombine them so that there's spillover, it's just going to be harder for those attitudes to sort of take their time and be transformed.
All right, Fred. Ginger Jackson Gleish is next. She is not on video, but she's on audio. So she's going to ask you a question.
Thanks, Megan. And hi, Fred. This is great. I'm sorry again that I don't have camera. We just moved and our internet is like a tin can. So I'm sorry about that. I am a lawyer at the Prison Policy Initiative, and I was previously at the Public Defender's Office in Oakland, California. And one of the things that we focus on here at the Prison Policy Initiative, and that I saw every day in court in Oakland, is the issue of criminal justice debt that arises out of fines and fees and bail and requiring people to pay for astronomically expensive phone calls and medical expenses from jail and prison, the requirement for people on probation and parole to pay for their own electronic monitoring and ankle bracelets and things like that. And what goes hand in hand with that is this notion that we often carve criminal justice involved people out of the groups that we think of as being deserving and worthy of our understanding. And I would just love to hear how you think about the issue of debt and dignity in the context of a group of people who are often carved out of the spaces where we decide that people have dignity or deserve dignity, and what the issue of debt might look like in that context, and how it intersects with some of the themes that you're thinking about. And this has been great. Thank you.
Well, thanks so much. So I think one of the things that is really a heartbreaking moment is there have been times where I've given presentations with people who are working in very difficult circumstances as counselors, and I will go through my spiel about people really need to feel as if they can make their own decisions, and then as soon as I start talking about choice and decisions, part of the room that had me pegged in one particular political way gets somehow greatly disturbed. And I think one of the things that we don't think about is what it feels like to be an adult. As some people say, I am a grown human, and people treat me as if I can't make a sound decision. And sometimes they treat you that way because you've made a mistake. And they will say, I'm not allowed to make a mistake. I don't get any margin for error. I don't get any opportunity to kind of learn as I go. And they find this to be really offensive. And they also will say, I'm getting this not just from people I think of as enemies, but people who have come to help. And so I think one of the challenges is that if your expectation is that people who are showing up to help you are going to somehow cause you some kind of moral injury, and they're asking you to be sort of fully forthcoming about how you're spending your money and what you intend to do next, they're going to tell you what they think they need to tell you to get them off of their backs. And they will sort of tell you that this is what they have to do because they know they're not going to be given the benefit of the doubt, and they know that their decisions will not be respected, even though they themselves are adults who feel as if they have a right to make decisions and a right to make mistakes. And so as we think about how we're going to do any types of intervention, and as we think about questions of justice, I think one of the things we have to ask ourselves is, in the course of justice, are we preventing people from having their own sense of salvation, a sense of salvation that we don't fully understand? And so I think that's one of the ongoing challenges here.
All right, Fred, Michael O'Reilly has a question about debtor support groups.
Megan, thanks. Fred, sorry to hog your time with the second question, but with regard to the issue of agency or empowerment for debtors, I'm wondering if, a support group's analogous to AA or a diabetes support group or anything like that might be a useful type of platform. And I'm just wondering, if someone at a meeting like that shares a narrative of employing a strategic intervention for their own debt, that might lead to more folks taking up that sort of an action. It just might be more readily accepted, and it empowers folks in a way that advice from an expert or a mentor, however well-meaning they are, just can't do. Are you aware of any pilot programs for debtor support groups, and has there been any benefit from them?
Yeah, so I've worked with Mission Asset Fund out in California, and one of the things that their founder has said to me over and over again is don't treat them like they're sick. And so the way that they do support groups is they have them talking about their financial experiences, but they did it in the context of, here's a loan product, a social loan that's really great, that's going to be great for you and it's going to help build your credit. But I would be helpful for us just to share some of your experiences and things that you have done that you find helpful or not helpful. And there, instead of thinking about how sick some of them are, they got to see people who were well. And so it flipped this notion of let's analyze the deficits and correct the deficits to a discussion of what are our existing assets, and what are some things that people who look like me have done and gotten great results. And so the information sharing and the trusting of that information still happens. But in his view and in the view of people at the Family Independence Initiative and elsewhere, what they have found is that when you lead with deficits, you're basically telling people there's something wrong with them. And the medical model of sort of, it's just like alcoholism. Like they don't feel like they're alcoholics. They feel as if they make too little and have to pay too much. And so part of that is trying to enter in a place that affirms the positive things about who they are. And so a version of what you're talking about, yes.
Okay, Fred, you've been very patient and stuck with us all the way to the end here. We have one more question from Kim Robertson, and then I think we'll be able to wrap up at that point. But Kim, please ask your question.
Sure. Thank you, Fred, so much. This isn't quite the symposium in person in San Francisco, but it was wonderful to hear from you. I just wondered, student loan debt, that's kind of a big topic to approach as we end your time with us, but just if there's sort of any big picture things you'd say about, do you see a bubble about to burst in that realm? It seems to be a different type of debt than most of what we've talked about today, but would love to just hear any big picture thoughts you have on the future of student loan debt in this country.
Oh yeah, student loan debt. So we hosted a symposium last October at Princeton on student loan debt. And one of the things that we wanted to do there is both highlight its size. And so in terms of non-mortgage debts, it's higher than your credit card debts. It's higher than your auto debts. Slightly higher, but it's higher. The other thing too is you're getting kind of a bimodal distribution with student loan debt. So if you're in a sort of the state university system versus you're in a private system that is not highly ranked, and you get this really awful bimodal distribution in which you have people who are at schools with very low endowments. And so if you're in the sort of bottom 80% endowment and you've racked up a lot of student loan debts, that's where you see the most troubles for students. And so one of the challenges then is that when you hear analysts say, it doesn't feel as bad as what people say. These are typically people who have gone to schools where it's actually not as bad as people say. And so you're having sort of the top 20% endowment wealth schools having a very different experience than the bottom 80%. And then the lower you go down in that percentage of endowment wealth, the more stark the situation is. And so it's there at that lower end, that low but fat end of the distribution, where you're going to see, I don't know how anyone expects that to be repaid. And so now there are discussions about, can we develop a clearer process for what discharge would look like? And so that's kind of where we are right now. But on our website, Dignity in Debt, if you hunt around for the student loan meeting, there will be sort of a synopsis of the discussions there. And one of the people who was there has now joined the UNC faculty, Tressie McMillan Cotton, along with, and then someone who didn't join UNC, but but was mentored by a former UNC Professor Darity, was also one of Professor Darity's progeny, Derek Hamilton. And so it was a lovely sort of end of the day discussion, and we brought in the former ombudsman from the CFPB for student loan debt as well. So we kind of had this concentrated meeting plus a bunch of international folks to talk about what it looks like in their countries. Because I find that, when you, whenever you're thinking about how to solve problems, if you're only looking internally, you can kind of miss out on what the possibilities might look like. And so I'm always sort of a big fan of bringing in perspectives from our colleagues across the globe who can help us think anew.
Great, I'll check that out. Thank you.
Wow, well, thank you again, Fred. What an amazing opportunity to get to spend some time with our community and learn about such an important issue. One of the people who had to leave the call early wrote me a note and said thank you. I'll tell you who it was later. She said she felt restored by this conversation. I feel the same way. Really, really rich conversation. And I feel like I've been to Princeton, which makes me feel really smart. So that's great. Thank you for sharing your wisdom with us today.
Well, I felt like I've been back to Chapel Hill, which makes me feel very smart. So thank you.
Awesome. Go Heels. That's right.
Go
You're
Heels.
Surrounded by Tar Heel love. That is for sure. Yeah. That's great. We hope everybody will join us next Wednesday at 4. Danielle Allen will give her talk, and she'll be talking about pushing for change without knowing the solutions. So please join us again for that call. And you're welcome to write little thank you notes to Fred in the chat if you'd like as you leave. What an amazing thing, Fred. And you're such a sport to call us from the road and to work with us on the tech stuff we all had going on today. So thanks so much.